Hello ladies and gentlemen, Panzer here, and today we're taking a look at the Division Beta. Now this is the version that I played recently on the PlayStation 4, and as you can probably tell, all of this is recorded in post, and the reason is recording using a capture card means I have to use OBS, and using OBS means I can't get the same audio quality that I normally get through DxStory just because of the setup that I have. Now I know anybody who knows anything about video and audio setup, which tends to be everybody in the comments section from time to time, will probably correct me on this and say you can do that. Yes, I know it is possible, but my setup is my setup, and the way it's set up right now doesn't work with that. So anyway, moving on. The Division. Well, this is a game that's been quite well hyped, quite well marketed, and the beta itself has had quite a lot of hype around it as well. And I've personally actually been quite excited for it because I was looking forward to it, and the main reason is I don't really know. Or at least maybe I do know now that I played the beta, so let's get on with it. We're going to start off with the most obvious thing, the thing that you can see right now is the graphics. Now this is on the PS4, mind you, this is not the PC version. I could have played this on the PC as well, but I wanted to try it out on the PlayStation 4 just for that extra stability and seeing if I could get some decent hours in it before it actually sort of went ahead. But as I've found out, no, the PC version seems quite stable, but that's not something that I was willing to gamble on at that point in time. So you can see the detail in the graphics here. In fact, in this particular part where I'm standing, you can actually see the lighting hitting the character's hair, and I specifically chose a character that had hair. The character customization is a little bit limited at the moment, so all you had were the choices of randomizing characters, and I chose one that had hair just to see what sort of effects that had, and I was pleasantly surprised. The hair actually has decent physics on it. It even moves very, very subtly, and the lighting hits it really realistically. On top of that, the weather effects. Now, weather is dynamic in this game, so while you have dynamic time changes, you also have, for example, night and day, and there's a very big difference between the two of them. There is also weather such as snowstorms, you get heavy rain as well, and all of these things not just look really good, but they also affect the game in a very interesting way because, of course, as you might expect, once a blizzard hits, you're probably not going to see further than a few meters, and that actually does affect the game quite severely, especially once you get into PvP. Now, the UI itself, as you can see right here, is very, very minimal. Stuff that is not needed, it seems to disappear, and everything sort of appears and disappears dynamically. And the menus are quite reasonably well laid out, although I will say there are a couple of issues with that as well. But as for the actual UI, I like it to a certain degree. I think a centered HUD does work very well with this. It's a third-person game after all, and the minimalistic look of it works really well with the sort of high-tech and very yeah, very sci-fi, techy look of the place. In fact, actually, the having it look very clean also provides a very nice contrast to the sort of very dirty and dingy world around you, which is very nice indeed. So you're sort of the clean elements, if you will, in this sort of world. But that might be reading a little bit too much into it. One thing I will say, and this is my main issue with the UI, is that the main menus and things are actually rendered in the real world, for example, going through the inventory. So as you can see in the scene right here, this is something I tested out with a friend of mine, you can actually have players walk around in front of your camera while you're accessing the menu. Now, I don't know if this is something that's going to continue to the main game. It doesn't really affect it because the menu is actually overlaid, so where in some cases where you can actually see there is a character standing in front of the camera, even clipping through the camera. It's not obstructing the menu in any way. It just looks very, very strange. I will say that if you're previewing items, for example, if you're switching out your equipment and your appearance, you want to see how things look, that could become a problem because anybody that is in front of your camera view is going to be blocking that. So that is a little bit of an issue. I don't know if this is going to be a big deal, but it does definitely seem possible to do something like that and really annoy somebody. Maybe it could be considered a form of griefing, I have no idea. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue, but it's just something I found very strange. I will say as well that on the PS4 at least there is quite noticeable pop-in if you're moving very quickly, if you're sprinting from place to place. Certain objects do take some time to load in, and I have captured some here as well. You can see these textures just sort of popping in, and they do take some time to do that, which is a little bit A little bit disappointing, but you know what, it's on a console at least. It's something that you really do have to look out for. And frankly, with a lot of things happening in the world, you probably won't notice it all that much. But for me, I'm looking out for these sorts of things, so that's why I did notice it. Now, we move on to the gameplay itself. Now, one thing that did confuse a lot of people about The Division was that it looked like a third-person cover shooter, and that's that. And it kind of isn't that. Yes, there are cover shooting mechanics, but this is more of an RPG, in the sense of games like Destiny, Borderlands, and to a certain extent Warframe. You have this sort of action RPG element of things, where your character's power and even your class, it is a classless system, but your class is really based on the equipment that you're carrying. So you could spec yourself out to be a character very focused on abilities, damage, or absorbing damage if you want to. And I'm going to use some MMO words here just to describe what's actually happening. The concept of aggro is actually a very big thing. Aggro meaning the amount of threat that you can generate to draw enemies towards you. So of course the higher threat you have, the more likely enemies are to shoot at you. Now I haven't seen any abilities that seem to draw enemy fire. Maybe the shield does that, but it's not something I personally tried, so I don't know if it actually does that. But I will say that loud weapons, particularly light machine guns, do draw a lot more attention than a silenced submachine gun or a suppressed submachine gun firing from the sides. In some cases as well, as you can see right here, it is entirely possible to have some tactics where you can suppress an enemy while somebody pulls a flank on them, and a suppressor really helps with that because it doesn't draw as much attention to you if you fire at the same time. Now, the cover shooting mechanics are actually quite satisfying to use, and they seem quite reminiscent of a game called Ghost Recon Phantoms, seemingly quite underloved free-to-play shooter that was in the Ghost Recon series and is still available right now, actually. And the cover shooting mechanics seem to work very similar to that. You have critical hits that you can have by hitting the enemies. The critical hit chance, of course, varies from weapon to weapon, but generally you have normal body shots and some of them will be a critical. And then on top of that, you have the standard headshot damage as well. So if you can pull off a headshot, you can actually still do extra damage anyway. So it's a cross between that sort of RPG and shooting mechanics, which is quite satisfying to use. If you're used to playing shooters, you'll probably not find any issues pulling off a headshot, and if you can do that, enemies seem to go down quite quickly, which is in stark contrast to what people were saying before about enemies being a bit too bullet spongy. I don't know if that's changed since the alpha, but the enemies do seem to go down quite quickly if you manage to land the right shots in the right place on target. Now, there is a little bit of auto-aim here, and that's to be expected of console shooters. I don't know if this is going to carry over to the PC version. If you have played the PC version, do let me know down in the comments whether this is there or not. But what I did notice was that there was a slight snap to target as a form of aim assist. The reticle does actually follow the target to a degree, but you still have to control your shots and you have to manage the recoil manually. So in some cases, if you just hold down the fire button, what's going to happen is you're going to end up firing bullets at the sky, and that's not what you want. So to keep your shots accurate, you still have to employ a bit of skill. But it's easy enough to pick up and use that the average player can probably still pick it up and play, and eventually get used to controlling their shots more accurately. Another good point about the game is that the realistic world is pretty much a one-to-one replication of Manhattan. In fact, the entirety of New York is going to be in the finished game through DLCs and all of that. Manhattan Island, on the other hand, is apparently part of the full base game, so that's something that's going to be coming in future. We have one section of the game, but it seems very nicely put together, although most of it, like the actual Manhattan Island itself, is a grid-based world. There are neat little shortcuts you can discover throughout the world. Certain alleyways, passages through buildings, and even subways do provide a very nice little way of crossing over to areas that you need to. While of course we understand that subways in real life are not like that, they have neatly placed debris and obstacles around the place so that it directs you towards a certain direction, and that does provide a nice shortcut for you to use. Now, if you're not the sort of person that likes mindlessly running around or even just having to run from place to place, there is a fast travel option that allows you to skip most of that. So if you're doing something, for example, going from the PvP area back to your main base of operations, you can just fast travel back there without losing too much in the process. Now, in the full game, you probably will miss out on things like encounters and certain encounters with civilians, which are dynamically created. It does mean that you can cut out a lot of that traveling time and a lot of the busy work. And while we're talking on the subject of missions and encounters as well, there is a very nice sort of variety in the missions. While a lot of the missions do have similar outcomes, for example, go to this place and kill a couple of dudes, that does seem to be a little bit limited. And you do get other types of missions, such as defend a pump station or free some hostages, and so on and so forth. I hope that they do add more mission variety, because they do eventually start blending and seeming the same, but at least the different locations do sort of change things up a bit. It's not a matter of always being in a situation where you're hiding behind cars and fighting people on a level playing field. Sometimes you're up on buildings, and sometimes you're underground. That level of variety, I hope that does continue through to the main game, because that is something that does break up monotony quite nicely. The mission layouts themselves as well do provide a very nice variety, and in fact do encourage group play. One thing that I did discover while playing with a friend was that one of the missions that is timed can very easily be beaten if you have another person go and activate another objective. So by spacing your team out a little bit, you can actually beat the timer very easily. While the timer is there, it's not particularly damaging to you. You can actually beat this mission very easily on solo, and in fact many people have. It just makes it a lot easier if you're playing with another player or even with a full group. And on the subject of teamwork is actually very well rewarded in this. There's a lot of nice use of passive synergy. For example, using the suppression ability. If you have a light machine gun, you can suppress targets, as I've said before, and then allow another player to pull a flank. On the other hand, it can draw attention away from a sniper, who can then take out hard targets very easily. All of these things do combine very nicely, and if you have a character that is very focused on using abilities such as sentry guns in future, that will allow you to set up traps and sort of damage boosters for your team that will help to draw attention away from players who are taking way too much fire. So there's a lot of synergy there that doesn't really need communication. In fact, because of the lack of friendly fire, especially in PvE or even PvP zones when you're in a group, it does allow you to be a little bit more liberal, so you can actually get public groups to work quite nicely without really having to communicate too well. Now, the whole classless system is quite interesting as well, because as I've said, this game does not have locked-in classes. Whatever class you choose to play depends entirely on your setup. You can spec your character out completely for damage by equipping gear and weapons that have all damage boosters and even mods. All weapons are modifiable, of course, to allow you to do the highest damage possible. So you could be a sniper or a flanking SMG user and have the highest damage possible, or you could be somebody who helps to draw the threat away from the rest of the team, and in that case you probably want to spec yourself out with the most health possible, and of course the loudest weapons you possibly can. All of these things are things that can be changed on the fly, so even in combat and under fire, if you happen to be carrying a bit of gear that might be more useful in certain situations, you can of course just switch that out. So if you're stuck in a situation where you find your team is just not doing enough damage, but you have a much better weapon that you can use for that, you can switch it out immediately and change classes just like that, which is something that's very, very useful. It does allow for a lot more team fluidity and a lot more versatility in tactics than I've seen in most other sorts of games that are very similar to this. And I think that it does make it a lot more interesting, especially when you're playing with a team. Now, where this game really shines, of course, is in the Dark Zone, the PvP element of things. It does have that sort of sense of paranoia. Whenever you see another player, you're never really sure whether to trust them or not, and thankfully I was quite lucky when most players were fairly trustworthy. However, you also can get ambushed by the NPCs, and in those cases, things get thrown into chaos, people start pointing the finger at who shot who, and in those cases, you need to probably keep an eye out on the other players, as they might just shoot you out of impulse. something that does happen from time to time. But because of that element of paranoia, you're never really sure whether to trust someone, and I haven't really felt that sort of level of sort of insecurity when playing a game, well, since DayZ, actually. So playing DayZ was the last time I had that sort of feeling, and this does that very, very nicely. I was playing with a friend for most of this as well, and I felt the same sort of thing. Even though I had somebody watching my back, you're never really sure whether to trust somebody else, and you probably feel a lot less safe if you're going into the Dark Zone alone. Now, Dark Zone itself is basically its own entity, really. You have your own set of levels, a rank that can go up or down depending on your performance. If you die, you lose XP, you lose currency, and so forth. It has its own currency, its own set of looting system. In fact, everything about it is very optional and very secluded or isolated from the rest of the game. If you're not the sort of person that enjoys PvP, you can skip it entirely, because there isn't actually any loot that you could get only in Dark Zone. It is definitely much easier to get high-level loot through Dark Zone. However, if you're not the sort of person that likes that, it's not something that punishes you just for not doing it. You can probably still find that same sort of loot from completing missions, and with the crafting system that's coming, you can get the blueprints to go and craft it yourself. So you could even skip the PvP entirely if that's something that doesn't interest you. But it's something that I found to be particularly interesting when I was playing it. I'm not the sort of person that likes PvP a lot in these sorts of games, but it's something that I felt compelled to keep trying again and again, participating on both sides of things, where we aided other players in taking down NPCs, trying to get the loot that we can. And of course the loot itself is instant, so if a character, for example a high-level boss enemy, drops loot, we all have a drop that we can pick up, and everybody's drop is slightly different. The only difference being, in Dark Zone, if somebody picks up something that you like, you can kill it and kill them and take it from them, so that's that level of paranoia there. There isn't actually much benefit to killing non-hostile agents who have nothing with them. Now, of course, shooting another player does activate something called Rogue Protocol, and that broadcasts your location on the map. Normally, agents do not show up on your map, and it can lead to a little bit of tension when you suddenly hear footsteps behind you that you didn't know were there before. It does make you constantly scan the environment and keep looking out for things, especially because the NPCs are also a lot higher level and a lot more difficult to fight in Dark Zone. But of course, being a rogue agent means that you have a bounty placed on you, and other players can claim that, and when you do die, unfortunately you do lose more than you would if you had just died as a normal agent. So that's something to bear in mind. And of course there is a sort of GTA style kind of hunting system. If you are going around killing players at random, for example, or if you generate high enough threats, an event is actually organized called a manhunt. So anybody entering the Dark Zone will not only know your location, they will know you by name, and there is a much higher bounty awarded for the group that takes them down. However, I'm not going to be singing praises about the game entirely. There are some things that I don't like, and things that I hope improve. For example, the game's controls. Now, I was playing this on a PlayStation controller, and the controls themselves are a little bit fiddly. They do take a little bit of getting used to, and frankly, some of it is very counterintuitive. For example, throwing a grenade requires you to press the left button on the D-pad to select it, and then pull the trigger to throw the grenade. Now, part of me would have thought initially to press the D-pad and hold it down and then throw it, but no, that actually switches the grenade selector instead of actually selecting the grenade. So it's a little bit tricky to get used to. There are tutorials, but it's still something that's quite counterintuitive, and it's something that it's very easily screwed up when you first try to do it. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. In addition, taking cover as well is a little bit strange from time to time. Switching cover, while it does have a dynamic cover switching system, it requires you to hold down the X button on the PlayStation, or the, I believe it's the A button on the Xbox controller, in order to complete that movement. If you release it at any point in time, which can happen by accident when you're making long movements, you simply stop in the middle of nowhere and quite easily attacked. the scrambling sort of movement your character makes does make you harder to hit, and I believe you do move slightly faster. Overall, having that sort of thing where you have to hold down the button seems to be a little bit, I would say, flawed, because if you do accidentally release that button, you are probably going to find yourself standing there and taking hits. Something I would say a better option is, or even just giving the player the option of having hold or tap to switch cover would be a better option there. Personally, I would prefer to just tap the button to switch cover and then maybe tap it midway through the movement to cancel it, rather than holding it down. But other people might see differently, so maybe having that available as an option to the players might be a better idea. Also, talking about holding down buttons, something that seems to be very common among console games as well is the whole hold to use rather than tap to use. When you're interacting with objects, in some cases you have to hold down the button to activate it, and what I've actually found with that is that the timing on that needs to be shortened very slightly, because in some cases it's far too long. Holding down that button can sometimes make you release the button prematurely because it's longer than you expect it to be. And when you do that, that cancels the action entirely. So if you're in a hurry, it can get a little bit annoying. It's not a big deal. After all, this is just nitpicking, really. But I do feel that this is something that could be shortened just slightly. I understand why it's there. I mean, it's to prevent accidental presses and all of that, and to make sure you really commit to using certain objects. But again, it's not something that needs to be as long as it is. And fortunately, it just is the way it is. I could be entirely wrong on this. Feel free to leave your comments down below, and I'll see what you guys think about that, because frankly, for me, I just found it was far too long. Context-based actions as well. This is something that's a bugbear of mine when it comes to a lot of games. I didn't like it when The Witcher did it. I don't like it when some of the Assassin's Creed games did it. It's basically whenever you're facing a certain direction or facing a certain object that it gives you a context-sensitive action. And what that means is, in this case, as you can see in this scene right here, interacting with ladders means you're facing the ladder, you press circle or the B button on an Xbox controller, and it'll allow you to interact with that object. However, when it comes to certain areas, because it is based on the direction your character is facing rather than where the camera is facing, for the most part. If you happen to be facing a railing but you want to climb down a ladder, what can happen is you leap off the ladder and take fall damage. Yeah, that is something that can get quite annoying very quickly. It is entirely based on your camera position, or your character position rather, and that's something that should be changed, or at least fine-tuned, so that that doesn't happen as often. Because when you're in narrow spaces in particular, and bear in mind this is New York, those emergency staircases that have been around since forever are all over the place, and a lot of the time you have to climb up these things, and it's a very narrow space to work with, so these sort of accidental presses can happen very easily. And it's the same deal when you go indoors. When you go indoors, the camera position can be a little bit awkward. It seems far too high and is scraping the ceiling for the most part, and there are a lot of things that happen indoors as well. Thankfully, combat doesn't happen too often indoors, except maybe the parking garage in the middle of Dark Zone. But aside from that, there isn't too much indoors, so thankfully that's the way it is, because frankly this camera position would make combat a bit awkward and a bit difficult to control. I found issues where going through doorways made me briefly not able to see anything because the camera would clip through part of the door, or the camera would auto-adjust and go completely the wrong way. Of course, all these things hopefully will be fine-tuned by March when the game releases. However, right now, it just seems like something that should be noted, because at the moment it is a problem, I find. Maybe one possible solution could be if the character goes indoors that the camera position automatically adjusts. We've seen this in other games before, and it seems to work quite well. Maybe lowering the camera, zooming it out slightly, those are all possible options when you're indoors, particularly due to the claustrophobic nature of it all. But that's something that at the moment is really quite bugging me. But all of these things combined are still very nitpicky issues. In fact, I found very little in the way of bugs even at this stage, and there's not a lot that I really didn't like. Yes, I did talk about the negatives for quite long, but then I talked equally long about the positives too. frankly, there's a lot to like about this game, at least in my opinion. And there's a lot of things that, while I hope gets fixed, they're all very, very minor issues. They still, even if all of the negative points I have pointed out in this video don't get fixed, it's still not going to be game-breaking for me unless they introduce something different, which ruins all of that, and we'll have to see about that when the game finally releases. But for now anyway, this is a game that's shaping up to be something quite good, and I'm honestly very happy about that, because it's rare that I get a chance to be excited about a game, and this certainly hasn't let me down. So here's looking forward to March, or even maybe if other beta tests come out, and I can keep you guys updated on what's happening with that. But for now anyway, it's shaping up to be quite the game, or at least it's shaping up to be everything that I expected. And frankly, that's not a very bad thing. But thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, feel free to click the like button. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. And leave a comment down below if you have any questions, or if you want to leave your thoughts on the game as well. And I will be sure to take a look through all of them. But as always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Panzer, taking a look at the Division beta. It's this version is on the PS4, and the game will be launching on March 8th. If nothing changes. And I'll see you next time.